Metroid remains one of my favorite gaming franchises. Recently, the Switch has helped to really recharge the energy tanks of the franchise through the release of Metroid Dread and Metroid Prime Remastered, as well as multiple classic Metroid games via Switch Online. This flood of content reinvigorated my interest in the series and inspired me to go back and revisit many of the games and even play some titles I missed. While diving back into so many of these games, I found myself locked in many internal debates over which ones were the best. After careful thought and consideration, I decided to rank the top 5 and make it official. I decided not to go with a top 10 or rank every game in the franchise. I just wanted to focus on the handful that I think are the best and really capture the essence of what I love about the series. So to clarify, this is just my personal ranked list of which 5 Metroid games I think are the best, not necessarily an objective list of where they stand with the community or broader gaming history or any of that. With that said, please remember to hit subscribe to support this content, stick around to the end for an honorable mention, and now let's get started with a CryWolf countdown. Beginning with number 5, we have Metroid Dread. I greatly enjoyed this entry in the series, but I also dread a few issues with it whenever I revisit the game. This entry delivers some major highs and lows that ultimately still tilt in the direction of an awesome experience. I think Dread has the best movement of the 2D Metroids and really captures the feel of controlling a nimble and powerful bounty hunter. Mercury Steam did a fantastic job of delivering smooth animations and tactile interactions with the environment. The graphics in this game also look fantastic, particularly on the deep colors of the Switch OLED. Environments have plenty of detail and life to them, creature designs are interesting, and there are plenty of flashy effects and interesting abilities. Although I don't think the different regions are quite as iconic as locations from other entries, Metroid Dread often feels modern and classic at the same time in the best ways. I also enjoyed the story of Dread. I think this game expertly handles blending cinematics and meaningful storytelling with the traditional isolation and subtleties of the Metroid experience. I've discussed this at length in some of my other videos. I really enjoy Metroid games that deliver a meaningful, specific story while retaining a sense of mystery and isolated exploration. It makes the occasional cinematic or story moment all the more powerful. You really feel like you've earned that next story revelation after progressing through long periods of environmental puzzle solving, combat, and isolation. The formidable enemy opponents really do create a sense of urgency and dread and deliver on the game's title. These are unique enemies that will try to hunt you down in certain zones and are impervious to all of Samus's weapons until you find the necessary power-up in that area. Unfortunately though, Metroid Dread has a couple of major issues that keep it lower on the list for me. First, and this might sound like an odd complaint for a Metroid game, but I found the map and world layout of this game to be almost excessively complex. I felt like I had to check the map constantly to know where I was going or where I was in the environment, much more often than in other entries. The map itself is also a bit strange and ugly, somehow managing to be both hyper-detailed yet also very cluttered and difficult to read. Even by the end of the game, I was still confused at points trying to decipher how certain connections between rooms on the map correspond to what I should expect in the real game world. This game is also enormous for a 2D side-scroller, and just getting around the entire world is an effort in itself. There are 6 or 7 large areas connected by trains, teleportation devices, elevators, and so on. It's a complicated game to navigate. I also found the later Emmy battles to be frustrating and borderline unfair. The endgame Emmys are extremely fast and aggressive and have their own power-ups like freezing abilities. I felt like the tools at my disposal to avoid them were not as powerful as they should be. Many times I felt like avoiding these enemies came down to repeated trial and error, and that the environments didn't always provide enough spots to hide or escape. Finally, some of the bosses in this game, while interesting, are absolutely brutal in terms of difficulty. The challenges spike sharply compared to the rest of the game, and it can be frustrating, particularly if you don't have enough energy tanks. Tracking down those additional energy tanks in this game is also fairly difficult due to the labyrinth layout I mentioned earlier. The combination of the brutal boss fights and aggressive enemies can make the late game sections of Dread a test of patience. The rookie mode that was released in a post-launch patch to me feels like what the standard difficulty should have been in order to not drive away new players. This was the first big Metroid game in a while, and I think this should have been addressed at launch. When it shines and gets into a good rhythm though, Dread is one of the best in the franchise. Number 4 takes a dark turn with Metroid Prime 2 Echoes. After the positive reception of the original Metroid Prime, Retro Studios and Nintendo quickly followed up with an even more ambitious sequel. Echoes is a huge, complex game that really pushed the GameCube hardware and the studio's design skills to the limit. However, the title became surprisingly divisive in the Metroid community due to the Dark World mechanics. Echoes takes place on the planet of Aether, which was split into two dimensions due to a calamity that arrived from outer space. The very atmosphere of the Dark World damages the player and features dreary, claustrophobic environments. These areas exist in contrast to the brighter, sometimes beautiful regions of the Light World. Now personally, I really enjoyed Echoes, probably more than most people. The amazing environment design and complexity of the world provides a deeply immersive experience. Many of these environments still look impressive even 20 years later. I also feel like this game really benefited from the Wii port, which added improved motion controls and widescreen support, which is really useful when navigating these complicated environments. Echoes is also easily the most puzzle-oriented 3D Metroid game, which makes the progression feel more rewarding. There are morph ball puzzles everywhere, plenty of lock and key progression mechanics, and many cleverly interconnected pieces of the world to unravel. This game just felt ahead of the rest of the pack on GameCube in terms of technical prowess and deep game design. I also really enjoyed the subtle story delivery in this game. Similar to Metroid Dread, I think this title did a great job of combining the isolated Metroid experience with occasional impactful story moments. While I certainly agree this game has some issues, which I discussed in depth in my potential remaster video, I think its strengths greatly overshadow its weaknesses, and it remains the deepest 3D Metroid you can play. Echoes just stumbles at times in its complexity and heaviness. Although I enjoyed the Dark World more than most, at times it does drag on too much and feels overly convoluted. The Dark World visuals also just look the same no matter what region you're in, with a very dreary purple-gray color scheme that never really changes. The game also forces the player to discover 18 temple keys throughout the game that can further grind the pacing to a crawl. I think Echoes rewards players who invest the time and energy to unravel its secrets, but some aspects of this game do just feel like a chore, which is why it sits a little bit lower on this list. Number 3 might be the most controversial placement on this list, which is Super Metroid. Now, I know many people watching this would definitely put Super Metroid at number 1, and that's totally understandable. It's an amazing game. Super Metroid really solidified the iconic Metroid game formula that would persist in the gaming industry for decades. However, I first played Super Metroid many years after it came out, so I have a bit of a different perspective of this game than some. What I discovered was a highly ambitious game well ahead of its time, with complex level design, tons of fun exploration and platforming, and cool environments. I was surprised at how well this formula was implemented so many years ago, and what Nintendo managed to accomplish on such limited hardware. Super Metroid actually gave me a deeper appreciation for the franchise entries that came after it. I enjoyed going back and discovering how this game influenced other titles like Metroid Prime. When I first started playing the game, it was mostly just for retrospective appreciation to see what this older Metroid game was like, but I was surprised at how immersed and impressed with the world I quickly became. This game was something really special for its time, and in many ways it still is. However, there are a couple of issues with this game that I personally found very difficult to look past in the modern era if you didn't grow up with this game. First, I think Samus controls and handles very rough in this entry. Timing or controlling touchy jumps, rapidly switching weapons, precision aiming, advanced moves, they can all be surprisingly difficult and tedious to pull off with the very basic SNES controls. If you aren't used to them from their original time, it can be a bit jarring and annoying to adjust to them today. Second, I found the late stages of this game to be extremely confusing and not all that fun. It's sort of hard to explain without just playing through it, but a couple areas are overly maze-like and not very clear, and I got lost for a long while. It doesn't help that this happens in the least interesting areas of the game aesthetically, and it really grinds the otherwise great pacing to a halt as you're approaching the finish. There are some other quality of life issues here as well, such as the very limited map system and lack of any sort of fast travel. Super Metroid was incredible for its time in most ways, but playing it years later also reveals some aging cracks in the Variasuit armor. Landing in the number 2 spot, we have Metroid Fusion. Originally released for the Game Boy Advance in 2002, Fusion delivered an awesome experience for a primitive handheld. I really enjoyed this game. I think it's a ton of fun, even though I don't think most people would rank it this high. Although the design is a bit more linear and simplistic than most Metroid games, the clear direction and faster pacing is a good fit for a handheld experience. I only very recently played Fusion for the first time, and I was pleasantly surprised by how great it looks and feels after all these years. The controls are very responsive, and Samus is as nimble as you'd expect. The game simply does not feel 22 years old, it feels like a modern indie game. In many ways, the controls feel like a more responsive or precise evolution of the Super Metroid controls, though not quite as smooth or fluid as Metroid Dread. However, Fusion has a much simpler map and level design than Dread, so I think it's actually easier to navigate overall. The world is broken into smaller pieces with simpler geometric designs, and the map is much more readable. Fusion also establishes a great mood throughout, with compelling visuals and sound design for the time. In my retrospective video about this game, I may have been a bit unappreciative of the audio, so after receiving comments around this, when I went back and played a second time, I paid closer attention to the audio, and I was pleasantly surprised. It's a moody mix that really establishes a strong atmosphere for a handheld game. In fact, I enjoyed this game more and more in general as I spent more time with it. The X-Parasite that hunts you throughout the game also succeeds in creating tension without becoming annoying by showing up too often. I greatly preferred this approach in comparison to the overdone or overutilized Emmys of Metroid Dread, for example. Fusion is also packed with interesting boss fights, though these can be a bit frustrating due to spikes in difficulty again. In my opinion, Fusion really doesn't have any glaring or significant flaws, though some Metroid purists might criticize the more linear design and the shorter length of this game. Personally, I enjoyed this approach. I don't think every single Metroid game has to be deeply open-ended and entirely exploration-based. I think Fusion still has plenty of moments where you have to explore and figure out how to get to a certain point, and plenty of power-up secrets to investigate along the way. It's definitely one of the more action or combat-focused entries in the series, but all of it feels great and just provides a lot of fun. And now we arrive at number 1. Metroid Prime Remastered is the greatest Metroid game of all time. Even without the remaster, I would have still put Metroid Prime at the top of this list, so the remaster only solidifies that status. Metroid Prime should have been impossible. Translating the iconic Metroid formula last seen in the legendary Super Metroid into a 3D first-person shooter was a truly daunting task for Retro Studios, but they delivered in an epic way. Metroid Prime was a beautiful and intricate game when it released on the GameCube in 2002. And 21 years later, the remaster helps it reach its full potential. Metroid Prime presents my favorite world and atmosphere out of any game in the series. From the explosive opening frigate escape, to the crumbling Chozo ruins, the frozen Phendrana drifts, the rainy Talon overworld, every inch of this game delivers a strong mood and interesting environments. Metroid Prime managed to successfully translate so many different systems into this 3D world. The lock-on combat mechanics, though a bit simplistic in 2023, worked really well for the time and are still fun and functional today. The shift to a third-person perspective for morph ball movements somehow just works perfectly and feels natural even though it was Retro's first try at it. I also love how the interesting visors provide different layers and perspectives to the world, including the scan visor, which lets you analyze enemies and notable points of interest for more information. The story is told in deep Metroid format, with minimal but effective cutscenes and an emphasis on investigating logs and ruins using the scan visor. The game is also a decent length for a first 3D entry and unravels with satisfying pacing for the most part. Metroid Prime still isn't perfect though. The game is a bit too heavily invested in backtracking, which is the only pacing issue, and it's made more noticeable due to the over-reliance on the Magmore Caverns acting as sort of a subway between regions. There is no fast travel option or teleportation spots to speed things up. The Magmore Caverns are also the least interesting environment in the game, even after a really nice visual overhaul in the remaster, so it can be annoying to have to track back and forth across them constantly. I was also never really a huge fan of the final boss in this game, though everyone else seems to like it, so maybe this is just a me thing. Personally, I found it to be a somewhat silly looking bullet sponge, and although the remaster does help a bit, it's still not my favorite. Overall though, Metroid Prime is a masterpiece that does so many things right with such a strong sense of place that it's easy to look past any minor issues. To wrap things up, I also want to give one honorable mention to Metroid Zero Mission. Currently, this game is very difficult to screen capture or even get a hold of since it doesn't exist on the Switch Online emulator yet, and the Wii U eShop is no longer available, so I don't have anything to show here for it in terms of footage. Zero Mission was an excellent remake of the original Metroid, and it delivered a great upgrade to that experience on the Game Boy Advance. It's an effective traditional sibling entry to Metroid Fusion, and I would have ranked it in 6th place on this list. However, personally, I think Fusion has a bit more of an interesting style and presentation, and it's something completely new versus a remake of an older game. The very first Metroid is one of my least favorite in the series, but Zero Mission goes a long way to make it more playable and more interesting. I really hope this game comes to Switch Online soon. It's been a long time since I played through it, and it would be interesting to revisit. So what do you think of this list? Do you agree with the rankings? Is it completely wrong? These are just my opinions, so feel free to leave your own in the comments and we'll discuss. Please hit subscribe to support this content, and thanks so much for watching.